So the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act was passed initially in 1975. And I think it's really important to note that before 1975, kids with disabilities had really no access to public school education. So kids with disabilities, intellectual, developmental disabilities, mental health issues, physical disabilities, they could be completely excluded from public schools. And so they may have been left to state institutions or their parents' homes and just really isolated in the community. So IDEA was a fundamental change in how the society treats kids with respect to education. So it is such a fundamentally important law, not only for parents, but also for the kids. And with respect to IDEA, it's also important to understand that there's a host of state laws that go along with it. And essential to both those state and federal laws, there are two fundamental principles. One of them is access to a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. And that needs to be provided to kids with disabilities at no cost to their parents, and it must be a good education, so not the maximum, not the minimum, but it also has to be provided by the public school. So we're not talking about private schools here. Now, along with the FAPE requirement, there's also the least restrictive environment concept. And that essentially means that kids with disabilities must be educated with their peers without disabilities. And again, this is really fundamental because there have been times where kids with disabilities have been separated from their peers. And that's fundamentally unfair. And it's really important to recognize that there's this federal and state obligation to make sure that kids are educated with their non-disabled peers. Now, within these two concepts, there are a number of steps that are important. So, for example, there's an obligation for school districts to do what's called child find. And that simply means that schools must look in their communities and see which kids might have a disability. And for those kids that might have a disability, they need to be given a full and fair evaluation to determine their disability-related needs and eligibility for special education services. Now, if those kids are eligible for special ed services, the school must develop a plan, a written plan, and it's called an individualized education plan. So once you've got this plan, the schools also have to implement it and implement it fully. Also importantly, with that obligation is the responsibility for the district to review what's going on with the kid when that IEP is actually being implemented. So it's not a static document, it's a document that gets reviewed on an ongoing basis. And so we have a cyclical process to make sure that the special education services are actually working. Now, I think it's also important to know that when you are in the special education process, parents have important rights. So, for example, kids might go into a discipline scenario, or the kids might get input into restraint and seclusion, and there are important rights and obligations for parents and for kids in those situations. But these rights also include things like process-related elements. So, for example, parents must receive notice of the kid's eligibility for services, changes to the kid's program, and other ways that schools serve kids. And importantly, once a parent gets those notices, they have a right to be involved. It's a parent participation mandate, as well as the ability for parents to challenge what a school district does in informal and formal dispute resolution systems. The last thing I'd like to add is that there's also another law called Section 504, and that's similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act, that makes sure that schools provide services on an equitable, equal basis to kids with and without disabilities. So fundamentally, kids with disabilities have the same access to educational services and programs, extracurricular, whatever, as kids without disabilities. I think where we're at is that because this law has been was originally passed in 1975, we have 40 years of experience with it. And I think it's important to recognize that some schools have done a wonderful job, and they've worked with parents to get to better types of services. There's more sophistication, there's better alternatives, there's more research on really what works, but there are still some schools that are stuck in the past. And some of these schools might not have very assertive or aggressive or even meaningful educational services. And I think it's really important to focus especially on kids who are 14 to 21. And that is such a critical time because at that point, schools have an amazing opportunity to help out kids prepare for life after school. And it's not just living in the community, but it's also access to college, higher education. It's access to work. We think that kids who are better prepared in high school have more access to integrated employment settings, fair wages, and also they contribute more meaningfully to society and to the economy. I think it is working, but I think there are some important caveats. So while we've made a lot of progress since 1975 when kids could be excluded from public schools entirely, we also have some extremely significant challenges, not only from a racial disparity angle. So for example, kids with disabilities who are Black, Hispanic, American Indian, they don't have as good academic performance. They're put into restraint and seclusion more often than kids without disability and in comparison to white students, as well as more discipline, school to prison pipeline. And so there are some pretty significant problems that exist in the school system and within the special education system. And in particular, as we're moving towards that critical age between 14 and 21, we still see that there need to be more robust, more accurate, more sophisticated services so that kids can get into employment experiences. They can figure out what it's like to live and be independently as possible in the community and to have access to meaningful lives just like everyone else.